Salutations, this is Mehmet Emre Dikyar and Ali Koruk from first class, and we are going to watch a video that our teacher has given to us as a task. The video is titled Introduction to Labor History, and it is made by the channel with the name Alberta Union. So just like yesterday night, we're going to comment on the video and describe the video. So let's just shall begin then. Shall we, Ali?
Yes.
All right.
Can we shall?
Is there something you would like to say before we start the video?
I don't have opinion
All right.
about this. Unfortunately.
The origin of unions.
My name is Henry Smith, and I want to tell you the story of how unions began and why workers in Canada joined. We need to travel back to medieval Europe, where most people were peasants, farming land controlled by feudal lords. In England, as early as the 1500s, the lords began to fence off communal lands. This process of enclosures made some peasants into dependent workers who relied almost exclusively on wages. The government always made sure that employers had the upper hand. Restrictions prevented workers from leaving to seek better wages or conditions. Masters and Servants Acts required workers to contract for long periods and made workers' resistance criminal offenses. Employers could dismiss workers for many reasons, but workers accused of violating their contract were often arrested and brought before hostile magistrates. Fearing revolt, the government eventually enacted a series of poor laws. The first such law, in 1536, was called an Act for the Punishment of Sturdy Vagabonds and Beggars. Most of the time, the unemployed were forced back to their home parish and put to work in the workhouse. Families were broken up. Children were apprenticed off to farmers and other employers. Gradually, the economic system changed, and capitalism first emerged in Britain and the Netherlands. Long-distance trade and new technologies dramatically increased production. This process of industrialization required large numbers of workers to toil in the first manufactories. The factory owners began breaking down jobs into distinct parts that could be done by untrained workers. Some even hired women and children because they always preferred to employ the cheapest labor possible. Employers exploited workers in ways that would be considered intolerable today, leading to frequent injury and early death. The new class of capitalists gained vast profits and put this money back into more machinery and their own luxurious consumption. Only property owners could vote, and basic rights to speak out or organize did not exist. As artisan workshop,
I would like to make a statement. It is because there was no technology back then, and people had to rely on human power. You know what I mean? Human labor.
Yes. I agree.
Like today, with the help of technology, you don't have to rely on human labor as much as back then. What do you think, Ali?
I don't agree with you because uh, in spite of technology, we need to human power in general labor
Yeah.
because machine is powerful, but they need to human labor or power.
You know, you try to mean that robots require human labor?
Yes,
Ah.
robots and machines require human power.
Like I just try to mean that autonomous labor will overthrow human labor, but you meant something else.
Humans or robots?
Sufficient, you mean?
Autonomous or robots, or a lot of machines isn't sufficient for production.
Yeah.
As you say, they need to require human power
You know,
in general.
there will be times that require maintenance, like a robot that is producing something gets broken and it requires maintenance. You mean?
Yes, I agree with you. Shall we continue?
All right.
Shops gave way to factory operations, skilled workers tried to deal collectively with employers. Many, such as masons and bootmakers, belonged to guilds. Guilds could determine the qualifications for apprenticeship and for becoming a journeyman, as well as what they would charge and how much they would produce. By 1800, British law regarded unions as combinations in restraint of trade, and the penalties for trying to form a union were severe. The Tolpuddle Martyrs served as an example. These 6 farm labourers in Dorset, England, formed a friendly society of agricultural labourers in 1832 to pressure employers to stop decreasing their wages. They were arrested, tried, found guilty of swearing a secret oath, and deported to Australia. The governments of Western Europe conquered far-off lands to supply raw materials for industry and cheap food for their rapidly growing populations. When the French and their rivals, the English, began to colonize what would become Canada, the settlers found an inhospitable but bountiful land that was already well populated by native peoples. Canada's regions developed distinctly because commodities like fish, fur, lumber, wheat, and minerals were exported. The cod fishery and the fur trade were the first 2 important European industries in Canada. Both were controlled by small numbers of rich merchants who relied on European and indigenous workers to harvest and process the fish and fur. Work in early Canada was dangerous and difficult. Some of the workers were indentured servants from Europe and both African and indigenous slaves. By the 1800s, many Canadians supported themselves as independent farmers, fishers, or craft workers. Entire families contributed to produce and sell goods. Wage earning was most often seasonal. Few waged work opportunities lasted year-round. Yet a growing number of wage workers were required to extract resources and construct the canals and railways needed to transport goods. Toronto and Hamilton grew into cities, joining Montreal, Canada's first city. Gradually, women and children were no longer employed for wages as frequently as men. Company towns relied on the production of a single resource, like coal, and provided some stability for the skilled workers. When violence erupted, usually because of the grinding conditions endured by unskilled laborers, the companies would close the company-owned store or call in the militia. When confronted with a sudden strike by rough laborers, some employers could replace the rebellious employees with other hungry immigrants. Many navvies or canal builders faced this in the 1830s in Ontario and Quebec, as did miners in Cape Breton and railway construction workers in Western Canada in the early 20th century. From the 1840s onward, skilled craftsmen like iron molders, carpenters, joiners, and cigar makers founded dozens of trade union brotherhoods. So many, in fact, that by the 1850s, Canadian newspapers accused them of leading an insurrection of labor. Craft workers took advantage of periodic upswings to join unions and made substantial gains for their families when their skills were most in demand. In the 1870s, over 200 strikes were recorded, triple the level of work stoppages in the previous decade. When economic times were bad, even unions of skilled workers found employers unwilling to bargain. Craft unions in Canada began to come together as a labor movement when they established local assemblies and joined British and American unions in their trade. Canada's first unified working class movement came about when craft workers formed leagues to reduce the working day to 9 hours, first in Hamilton and rapidly elsewhere.
I believe there will be no use to lower the time of working, hour of working. What do you think?
I think the worker the workers working hours is so long
Yes.
in the story when we compare this time.
But what I mean is that decreasing the working hour only by itself isn't sufficient. Like you gotta have to if a worker works for a long time, they gotta have to increase the wage.
Um, in the story, the wage of the workers are so low,
Yes.
so low when we compare this time workers, because in the story, the peasants or normal workers are working a lot of hours, up to 15 hours. When we compare this time is normal workers are working maximum 10
Yes, 9 or 10 hours.
9 or 10 hours.
Yeah.
That's all, I think.
We shall continue that.
In their own bid to secure a 9-hour day, Toronto printers went on strike in 1872. Their employers had 18 printers arrested. Seizing an opportunity to gain workers' favor, the government passed the Trade Unions Act. Unions were legal for the first time, but many restrictions also limited their power. Employers were under no obligation to recognize or bargain with a union, and picketing remained a criminal offense. Large parades around this time were becoming regular labor festivals. Craft unionists proudly showed off the important place they'd established for themselves in their communities. They believed the skills that earned decent wages and social respectability made them an aristocracy of labor. Their celebrations were the forerunners of Labor Day.
Industrial unions.
My name is Vasil Aliniak, and I have a story to tell you about industrial unions and workers in Canada for almost 100 years since Confederation.
Industrial
Our
and
lives were
technological
forever
unions.
Yes.
Industrial and technological unions time.
Yeah. That's being what age? There's no.
That, that's being industrial unions is make easy work to
Yes.
workers and make faster this work.
Faster work.
Yes.
But all of these are now our pasts. So talking about the past will be no use for our today's world. Today, people no longer experience the issue of labor problems like they used to be, as robots have taken over. What do you think?
This time, no workers living less, living less confusion about work.
Yeah.
because they are using the technology to produce or work about anything.
Yeah, I feel you. So I agree with you. Uh, by the time there will be an ideology with the name socialism because of those labor issues. Socialism.
Socialism is depends on human rights
Yes.
and ethic working conditions
Yes.
and less working hours uh, and more rest
Yes.
to workers because it can faster it can be faster production, it can be faster production about any work.
Yes.
That's all I think.
We shall continue then.
Yes.
My name is Vasil Aliniak, and I have a story to tell you about industrial unions and workers in Canada for almost 100 years since Confederation. Our lives were forever transformed by factories, which grew and spread because the railway linked distant communities and opened markets. At first, craft unions flourished. They resisted employers' efforts to destroy apprenticeships and control the labor process. New types of skilled workers, like machinists and locomotive engineers, eagerly formed unions. But they put up walls around each trade to keep out competitors, and the great majority of workers were still excluded from the modest gains achieved by skilled working men. This set the stage for the Great Upheaval. In the 1880s, politicized workers became interested in an aggressive new unionism to improve conditions for all workers. Socialists in British coal mining towns created all-in unions for the first time. Life in tight-knit industrial towns or neighborhoods encouraged a sense of solidarity and community-wide unionism. The Knights of Labor were one of the first unions to organize the unskilled and include women and black workers. They promoted the ideal of the honest working man. Established in the United States, the Knights quickly spread through Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, forming almost 450 local assemblies. Their success so concerned the government, it was one reason for appointing the Royal Commission on the Relations of Labor and Capital in 1886. The new unions faced many obstacles. First, craft unions expelled their own members if they also joined an industrial union. Secondly, employers could easily fire employees suspected of organizing a union. And of course, governments and courts frequently intervened in labor conflicts on behalf of employers to protect the so-called industrial peace. Even the Industrial Disputes and Investigation Act of 1907 did little to redress the power imbalance between unions and employers. Nevertheless, early industrial unions were able to extract some concessions. Unionized coal miners, for example, forced employers and the state to make their occupation less murderous. Many workers also joined or supported socialist or labor parties, which were increasingly successful in electing their own candidates. Still, others doubted meaningful reform could be achieved through the ballot box and turned instead to ideas of revolution. The industrial workers of the world aimed to unify all workers into one union to overthrow the capitalist system. The Wobblies, as they were called, rapidly gained support in Western Canada. Fearful of the IWW's commitment to free speech and direct action, employers and the government recruited labor spies and vigilantes, and would arrest or simply murder Wobblies. When the Great War erupted, many workers made a bloody sacrifice on Europe's battlefields. Joining the military meant, among other things, earning a steady wage. Failing to entice enough recruits, the government conscripted more. Conscription angered many workers. They resented wartime profiteering and their bosses' unwillingness to recognize unions. Prices rose faster than wages. More than 400 strikes erupted in 1919, prompting a worried government to establish another inquiry, the Royal Commission on Industrial Relations. The Winnipeg General Strike and sympathy strikes like it symbolized this great labor revolt. Delegates at the Western Labor Conference in Calgary formed the One Big Union and sent fraternal greetings to comrades in the newly formed Soviet Union. The 1920s did not roar.
I believe Soviet Union isn't innocent as it seems. Like they seem to help the workers, but they force people to work by locking them up to the gulags. Do you know what gulag is?
I don't
A
know.
working prison. Like you gotta have to work. You're imprisoned. You're incarcerated.
You have to work
Yes.
for them.
Yes. Like if you go against Soviet Union, they lock you up in a gulag. What do you think, Ali?
They wanted to workers to work for them because they don't want to give wage
Yes.
workers
It's basically slavery.
or this I think I agree with you. It's basically slavery and luck workers.
Yes. Lack of.
I can I say luck workers?
What do you mean by luck? You know, L-U.
Slaver workers. Slavery workers.
Slave workers.
Slave workers, yes.
Like I said, Soviet Union was a bloody regime that forced people to work in gulags for them. By the time they pretend to be worker friendly, you know, labor friendly.
I think they have a strict restriction about public,
Yes.
or they wanted to workers for free,
Yes.
or they wanted to people to
Yeah.
going to war.
They force people to go
Yes,
to work.
they force to people to going to war.
Yes.
That's-
Anything else?
That's all.
All right. We shall continue then.
For working class families. Many were unemployed and at least half were poor, struggling constantly for food, shelter, and clothing. It was a period of retreat for organized labor. Most employers took advantage of the downturn to fire troublemakers, roll back wages, and installed company unions. A minority of large companies implemented welfare schemes and joint labor management councils to co-opt workers and secure workplace harmony. By 1929, untrammeled capitalism led to a spectacular market crash. A decade of depression ensued. About 1 million Canadians were unemployed, or 1 in 4 workers. Many left home to scavenge, and single men were sent to work camps. Unemployed workers organized the On to Ottawa Trek, a cross-country march starting in Vancouver that the RCMP violently disbanded in Regina. Poverty and despair increased the appeal of radical politics, and workers embraced new political parties. The communists organized the unemployed and families on relief. The Cooperative Commonwealth Federation would eventually form the first socialist government in North America when Tommy Douglas became Premier of Saskatchewan. sit-down strikes of U.S. auto workers and early successes of the newly formed Congress of Industrial Organizations inspired the industrial workers in Canada. When General Motors sped up production in Oshawa and refused to recognize union representatives, more than 4,000 workers walked out. The strike was won in 15 days, marking a coming of age of industrial unionism in Canada. The 1935 Wagner Act, part of the New Deal in the United States, compelled private sector employers for the first time to bargain with union representatives. Some Canadian provinces followed suit, including Alberta in 1938. But it was not until 1944, when the federal government declared Privy Council Order number 1003, that a new regime of compulsory collective bargaining began to affect all of Canada. The government was trying to maintain wartime production, because full employment had encouraged Canadian workers to strike in unprecedented numbers. The system of modern industrial relations was cemented by strikes after the war, like Fort Windsor, which led to what is called the Rand Formula. The labor movement accepted a major trade-off, giving up on workplace militancy and attempts to control production to instead pursue gradual increases in purchasing power. This was the post-war compromise, and in the golden years that followed, social programs of the welfare state provided security. Negotiated wage increases and benefits improved the standard of living for many Canadians, especially for members of industrial unions. But unions were expected to behave responsibly, and were legally required to police their own members. During the Cold War, the struggle against the Soviet Union became the pretext for unions to purge progressive thinkers, and for governments to enact restrictive anti-union legislation. For labor, the future looked uncertain.
I don't want to sound like I am defending the United States here, but I don't see any people from Soviet Union used to live with a relief. Like even Stalin's daughter escaped to America. What do you think? Like Soviet Union doesn't seem like innocent as it seemed to be.
Soviet Union is acting unethic
Yes.
for workers,
Yes.
and they aren't giving the rights to public or normal workers,
Yeah.
and they don't have ethic acts about working issues.
Yeah.
And that's all.
Like
For
they
me.
get like they overwork and they get minimum wage. Like, and if they go against the government, the regime, they will end up being locked up in a gulag.
They depended on just profit.
Yes.
They are looking their incomes for or from their fabric or labor or normal workers. They give less wage
Yes.
to workers
Yes.
because they wanted to more and more profit.
They are dependent on the profit. Yes.
Yes.
All right. Something else? Anything else?
I don't know.
All right then.
Hi there, my name is Chantel Turgeon, and I have a story to tell you about how government employees came to think of themselves as workers and surged to the forefront of Canadian labor. In the first half of the 20th century, Parliament and provincial legislatures grudgingly supported collective bargaining between workers and private sector employers. The public sector was considered different. Government employees saw themselves as civil servants, and had no say in their working conditions. The few jobs governments created were doled out to individuals with connections to elected officials. A change of government meant wholesale firings of civil servants. In 1885, Manitoba was the first province to legislate a Civil Service Act and made it clear that any request for a raise shall be considered as a tendering of the resignation. The view that public sector workers were servants persisted for decades. As late as 1964, Quebec's premier proclaimed, "The Queen does not negotiate with her subjects." Post offices were among the earliest public services to organize. The wages of letter carriers failed to keep up with rising costs of living. They were not awarded even a single salary increase for 30 years. The Railway Mail Clerks Association formed in 1889, a union of letter carriers formed 2 years later, and of postal clerks in 1911. But they were lobby groups rather than recognized collective bargaining agents. During the turbulent years around World War I, civil servants faced high inflation and followed the lead of private sector workers who established unions. Firefighters in Edmonton, for example, organized and won a collective agreement. Teachers at this time were angry that school boards decided unilaterally to dock pay for the war effort. By 1921, 2/3 of Alberta's teachers had joined the ATA, and there had been a major strike of Edmonton teachers. Governments were typically intolerant of strikes and reacted harshly, especially against those it considered instigators. In 1924, a national strike of postal workers was broken by wholesale dismissals. Police who struck in Quebec and in Toronto met the same fate. Such firings set an example and helped discipline the remaining workers. The government managed to suppress attempts of public workers to organize, in part because the civil service remained small right up until World War II, when barely 8% of the Canadian workforce was employed in education, health, or government service. Divisions among public employees also contributed to the problem. For example, efforts by a union to organize all federal workers met resistance from white-collar workers who regarded themselves as a cut above the blue-collar. The large number of classifications in the federal civil service encouraged competition that obstructed efforts to create unions. Changing conditions in the post-war years eventually helped unions make major breakthroughs in the public sector. The example of industrial unions was contagious, and public employees envied the new rights and steady increases in purchasing power won by many workers. The public sector began to grow rapidly, both in size and complexity, and more workers were required to deliver the new programs of the welfare state. Hospitals, schools, and suburbs grew in step with Canada's population and affluence. Most new union members from the mid-1960s forward were civil servants, municipal employees, healthcare workers, teachers, and others. Many worked in occupations that had no private sector counterparts, like air traffic controllers and lighthouse keepers. Steady growth in government employment meant that by the end of the 1960s, 1 in 5 workers was a public employee. In the decade after it was founded in 1963, the Canadian Union of Public Employees doubled its membership and passed the United Steelworkers to become Canada's largest union. It was a sort of industrial-style union of the public sector. The face of organized labor was changing quickly. Public sector unions like CUPE gained hundreds of thousands of female members, reflecting the rapid growth of paid employment for married women. The 1960s were a remarkable time of new militancy, especially in Quebec, where the Quiet Revolution was underway. Students and feminists protested, and a new generation of workers led hundreds of defiant wildcat strikes from 1964 to 66. Rank-and-file union members angrily challenged the deal of the post-war settlement, surprising not only employers and government, but also union officials. For public employees, the illegal National Postal Strike in 1965 was decisive. By 1967, the Public Service Staff Relations Act became law, giving federal employees the right to choose between compulsory arbitration, mediation, or a strike. At long last, public employees had collective bargaining rights similar to private sector workers. The provinces followed Ottawa's lead, and the provincial civil service associations all became unions. By the early 1970s, every province had accepted some form of collective bargaining with its employees, except Ontario and Alberta, which both refused to concede public workers the right to strike. The Canadian labor movement would continue to grow for only about a decade. Union density peaked in the mid-1980s, with over 40% of Canadian workers organized in unions. Unionized public employees came to outnumber union members from the mostly male industrial workforce, which had begun shrinking. Starting in the 1960s and increasingly thereafter, foreign-owned corporations began to shut down branch plants in Canada, laying off hundreds and even thousands of mill and factory workers at a time. By 1970, Canada had tipped into a serious recession that made it seem futile to go on organizing. The deindustrialization of the Great Lakes region devastated private sector unions, and also meant that unionized public sector workers increasingly found themselves as the vanguard of a weakened labor movement. It was a tough time to be a unionist. Soaring inflation, economic stagnation, and the energy crisis of 1973 all gave big business and the state the excuse they needed to crack down on unions. Wage controls nearly provoked a general strike in 1976, and the free trade agreements that followed increased the power of corporations and helped deregulate labor markets. Some call it neoliberalism. Some call it globalization. But whatever the name, it hasn't been good for workers or the public services they rely on. More and more people count themselves lucky to hold precarious McJobs with deteriorating conditions and declining real wages. If public sector unions don't defend public services, who will?
I'm Sophie Guinnessue, and I want to tell you about the history of some of the most marginalized workers in Canada and their important struggles for fairness and inclusion. Workers have always been diverse, but many unions ignored the needs of some people, like Indigenous, immigrant, women, or lesbian and gay workers. Early on, only people considered radicals grasped important ideas now generally accepted, like organizing all workers and fighting to improve conditions for everyone. Since time immemorial, First Nations people lived off the land and shared what they produced. They made crucial contributions to our economy that have largely been ignored due to persistent negative stereotypes. Indigenous technology helped the first European explorers and settlers to survive. First Nations participation in the fur trade made possible the very earliest accumulation of wealth here. Some ran cottage industries and were independent producers. But by the 1850s, more worked for wages, especially in resource extraction industries in British Columbia. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some Indigenous people joined unions or supported the strikes of other workers. For example, Indigenous workers established some events.
I think over exaggerating the situations like this would make people hate workers, you know. They always right, and I'm gonna die, hate them. You know, the mindset of, you understand the mindset of what, some mindset of it, Ali, sorry.
The union
Yes.
hates workers because they are surging, surging their rights
Yeah.
from union because union don't give their rights or wage.
Yes. The wage they deserve to.
Yes, the wage they deserve. So the workers urging their rights in general,
Yeah.
and so they are building their fabrics or their work.
Yes.
But the government don't give right to build their work.
Yeah.
So,
Like involving the situations such as lesbians, gays, bisexuals is unnecessary. Like if you're a worker, then you're a worker, nothing else. Like you're a lesbian worker, I don't give any, you know what I mean. I'm not
discrimination.
yes. Like it's discrimination. Like if you're a lesbian worker, what do I care?
The governments need to uh, don't discriminate about lesbian or gay or
Yes,
male or female workers
doing so is unnecessary.
because who cares?
Yeah,
Who cares? I think.
like you're writing a sign that says I'm a lesbian worker, and like you say showing the sign to people. What do I care?
Because all of them is part of the system.
Yes.
Even you,
Yes.
me, or lesbian male or a gay female, lesbian female or sorry, or gay male, or male or female, who care? As I say,
Yeah. People like are the main reason why people are the main reason why homophobia is on the rise. Like you're dictating your sexual preference.
in general, even this time is homophobia or discrimination about gay or lesbian persons,
Yeah.
unfortunately. I hope we are
Exceed.
yes. I hope we can exceed this discrimination in
Overcome the situation.
in the future.
Yeah.
In the future, or to 2023.
I get you.
That's all.
Alright. So if you notice, we have exceeded the 40 minutes of record.
Yes.
Shall we continue watching, or as to talk more? Shall we continue watching, or should we end the video here? What do you think, Ali?
Can we end?
Can we end? Yes, you gotta have to go to work. So Ali has to go to work. He works in a kahve sokağı as a, where you're bartender there.
Kitchen.
Waiter, yeah, kitchen.
Yes.
All right. So
Kitchen personal.
yes, we're gonna have to end the video here. Teacher, I hope you like this video. We try to do our best. So the time is about to be 2 p.m. and the date is 23rd of October 2021. I hope you like this video. I hope we get the marks we deserve. Signing off.
Have a nice day.